Hey, it's Stu, and this is going to be sort of like a reading wrap up. Not too much synopsis, but just some like passing thoughts about what I liked or didn't like about a book. So, slight review, but I don't really like to give star reviews. Um, but I do like to discuss my experience with books. And for folks that I give, because almost 100, like 99% of the books that I read, I give away. So when I do give them to a select person, I'll provide as much context as that person likes. Joy Williams's 99 Stories of God, published by Tin House, was my most recent listen. I came to know about this book from the Supposedly Fun channel. And this book was just, it's little vignettes, which cover sort of existential thoughts. Yeah. And some of them are just so exquisite, and other ones are like, but I found as a work, I really liked it. The concept of it overall, the writing was luscious, and some of the stories really landed well with me. Several people I have recommended this book to, wondering if reading it with eyes is different than listening, because listening was probably quite a unique experience, just given to how small these stories are. So I describe them more kind of like vignettes, but it's short, and it was a great time for me. It was like kind of some glue that held together a couple books. So I'm not all the way done with this book, but I'm very nearly done with this book. And this is The Blinding Absence of Light by Tahar Ben Jaloun. I'm determined to finish this book, but I've had to take it in small bites because this book is heart-wrenching and devastating. Tahar Ben Jaloun handles the story, which is the story of particular protagonist imprisoned in a secret prison in the desert after the military coup in the late 1970s in Morocco. And then due to a lot of international pressure, these prisoners were released 20 years later. This is the imagined story of one. There's a lot of faith in this book, and that's really what pulls the protagonists through, and the reader as well. And so I thought that it was like 99 Stories of God was more like snippets, but it helped sort of like hold my mind together in some of the more graceful pieces even of this work, because there is a lot of really explicit misery in this book as well. And I don't know, like, I'm glad that I read it. I'm glad that I know about it. I'm glad that I had the strength at this moment to not fully look away. And also this book is a heavy. It is about the blinding absence of light. The end, I know that in the end, these prisoners are released. But it's not something to power through. I have to take it in small little nibbles. So when I feel strong enough to get back into this text at all, I will finish it. But I wanted to talk about it in this video because I wanted to talk about it in juxtaposition with the 99 Stories of God, which aren't all delightful, but are kind of little boulders of sort of existential thoughts. The Vegetarian by Hong Kong, I think, also is a really subtly tragic work. This story, I was fully aware of the premise, and I wasn't fully aware of how this subtle terror and emotional tension was going to build up, because I do believe the story builds. Even though it's told from three completely different perspectives and ways, I do think it culminates into something that really builds, where there's a lot of emotional and intellectual processing that you don't even realize that you have to do to get through this small story. And then once the curtain's drawn, the last cover is closed, you're still working on it. I'm still like, it's going to stay with me for a very long time. A friend of mine who read it some years ago said, I'm sorry, I should have given you content warnings. And I'm like, how is one warned, and what do those warnings looks like? Because of this subtlety and the intricacy and the way in which Hong Kong does this brilliant work. If you don't know, this story is told from three perspectives about a woman who decides to become a vegetarian. And as a testament of, body autonomy and female autonomy and autonomy of choice, none of the three characters that are telling the story about this woman can accept that. And this is deeply symbolic. However, in sort of allegorical, but also just profound ways, like that symptom that we all know, like that thing that seems so simple, like, duh, like, why wouldn't you just let somebody be a vegetarian? Is such a symptom of the fact that you need to assert control, and control is a form of abuse. And then, there's a lot of lines that get they get so taut that they get blurred in this book. So we start with the husband, who is a deplorable character. You don't like him right off the gut. He's a very unlikable character, and he's talking about his wife in really disparaging and non-flattering ways. And then her decision to become a vegetarian. So you think that it's just, this guy's a total dick, and I feel bad for her. But then you sort of like layer in the family dynamics on top of that. And by the time you get to the second story, which is the vegetarian's brother-in-law, it becomes something, this book becomes a completely different book. And it shows that, there's control, but there's also exploitation that can happen to folks who don't have power and or are vulnerable. And then the last part of the book is her sister, who really loves her, who's trying to struggle with the condition of who I'm going to call the vegetarian, the person who this book is about, we never get to hear her voice, as a very extremely clever decision by Hong Kong. This is the kind of book that one must have the strength to read several times, I believe, because of the subtleties, because I just it crept up on me in ways that I can't quite articulate. And I know because of that, I will be more cognizant and more alert of some of the devices Hong Kong's using on a reread. However, I have now in my possession 3 other Hong Kongs that I'd like to get to first, but this will be one of the very rare ones that go back on my shelf for an ensuing reread, or maybe a buddy read, maybe a buddy reread. I finished after The Vegetarian, and hadn't planned to, but I kind of just needed to hop right into something, The Keep by Jennifer Egan. Part of the reason I kind of bumped this up into this week to read this week is because I do plan, I think, if I haven't said it, I thought it, I'm going to swap this for Look at Me, which is Jennifer Egan's other work, by someone who was reading it and said, look what I'm reading. And I said, oh, I'm about to read The Keep, and let's read them this week and swap. So I wanted to make sure it got read and I get the video made of this. I was not a big fan of A Visit from the Goon Squad. I think it was timing, but I also just think that book didn't work for me in fundamental ways. And I found myself perplexed, what is it about this book that is Pulitzer and or all these, what's the hype? Which is fine. I don't think there's a single book that's for every reader ever. And I think that Jennifer Egan herself is the kind of author that probably has lots of like people love her and then people really don't like her for some of the reasons that the Goon Squad didn't work for me. I like this book quite a bit more. I appreciated that there's a story within a story in this book. So we have this thread of two cousins, and one of the cousins was part of a really, I wouldn't call it a practical joke. I would call it a really cruel bullying incident that was extremely dangerous to the life of the other cousin. And Howard is the other cousin's name. And it's Daniel, I think. People, like, some names kind of get changed within this. In any case, is the name of the one who was sort of the perpetrator. Fast forward many years later, and life goes on in adult lives. Like, things don't turn out the way that anybody thought, and we follow the two cousins meeting again at a castle in like the German-Czech border, where the aim of this castle is to where Howard is taking on a project to renovate this castle, and he's called the cousin in, and there's some like perhaps redemption, perhaps not. We find out a lot of things about the castle. It's really atmospheric. It's a bit fever dreamy. And then there's another story nestled within where we follow a character named Ray, who's imprisoned. And he's in a writing group, and he's writing the story of the castle. And so we're trying to figure out what's real and what's not real and who's who. And there's definitely a lot of sort of like, there's some horror elements in this book, and there's some fever dream elements. And then there's like, the stories are nestled together, but they cross over at some points. And I think all of that Jennifer Egan did quite well. And I think that it's a quite propulsive book as well. And it built atmosphere, and I found some holes in it, and there were some things that I didn't quite like. I don't think it's worth really bringing up, because really I'm here to say that I like this book way more than I thought that I would. And isn't that great when the like didn't meet expectation goes in that positive way? So definitely not worth, I don't plan to reread this book, and I do plan to pass it on. Like I do all of my books, but this one has already its determined home, a swap home. Hollow Kingdom by Kira Jane Buxton. I did this mostly on audio, and the reader, who I need to get better at writing down who the narrator of the audio was, because it was the same narrator as Everything is Illuminated. And it took me a really long time to just like get that voice from when I listened to Everything Illuminated out of my head, because of the impact that Everything is Illuminated had on me. And make it the voice of, ST, our hero. This is a hero's journey. And it's a sort of like zombie apocalypse happening in the city of Seattle, and the city of Seattle was done fantastically. I love setting, and I thought that the setting of Seattle was done very well. It really, really played with setting. This book did, and it definitely played with the zombie apocalypse genre, and it was satire, and it was silly, and sometimes it was stupid. But I think overall it really worked. There was one moment about the sun rising. There's a quote towards the end where the sun does its job to rise. And there's some beautiful, beautiful lines in this book as well. This book, I think there's a queue of people who are interested in it. So we'll see where it goes from here. But I think that I'll be following kind of a chain of it getting passed along. And it was a fun read. And I kind of needed a little bit of like what this book was, which was satire, and to take like heavier themes but kind of make them silly, and like I said, to be even at sometimes stupid. And I needed that, because I've been reading some really, really, really heavy books, and I've been reading this Blinding Absence of Light for quite some time, and every time I pick it up, it's devastating. Wayward by Amelia Hart. This is a beautiful cover. This story follows 3 timelines of a family, 3 different generations of a family of women whose last names are Wayward. It starts with a fantastic, the epigraph is from Macbeth. And I really appreciated that. I thought that that was done really well, and it did set a tone for me in this book. My overall experience with this book was, sadly, I just don't get the hype. I found it, myself, I found it mid at best. And without being super disparaging, like, it just, it lost opportunities to be notable. And where I appreciate, storytelling across generations of women, looking at, women who have been accused of witchcraft. I actually even think that it missed a lot of opportunities there. Some shoddy character development, some even worse, like, use of tropes, and some plot holes. And then the prose was also not great. So it's one of those things that I keep thinking, like, people must have really engaged with it because they liked the story. They liked access maybe to the story. And that's all I can say. Like, I obviously picked these 2 books for a reason. If you wanted to read stories about witches, I would, have several others to recommend. Before this one, I thought that it had themes, it had central themes that I generally like, but just didn't execute very well at all. Geraldine Brooks's Horse. This is my second Geraldine Brooks work. I really appreciate in the 2 books that I've read by Geraldine Brooks is that she looks at an object and then tells the story of all of the people around the object. And in this case, it's about Lexington, but it's really about a painting and the skeletal remains of Lexington, who was the sire of, like, I think even more recently, whomever won the Kentucky Derby was one of, like, Lexington's great grandchild. I learned quite a bit about horse racing and the history therein in Kentucky. I liked the way that Geraldine Brooks wrote in characters, Black characters, as a white woman, with sort of the sensitivity and the meta, sort of like the awareness that she's a white woman, with some sort of like what I would say was like modern political awareness, perhaps influencing her writing. And I'm not saying that as if, like, considering that people's histories and people's lives should ever be politicized as a way to get people to, vote for you so you can bomb other countries, regardless of what side of the political spectrum your voters are on. But in any case, without the diatribe, like, I liked the awareness, and I thought that it was sort of informed in the way that I was suggesting, but gentle. And yeah, and what it did very clearly was, it was aware of white saviorism, and it tried to write a book where there are certainly interracial interactions between characters, and a book that has to recognize slavery and the impact of enslaved people on human beings, because it's writing a book about history, but without sort of pontificating and or falling into the white savior myth full-heartedly. I loved reading. I'm a horse gal. So reading about horses and their grooms and their jockeys and their skeletons was great. Sometimes it gets a little too dense in, like, the explanation of some sort of like the details of horse skeletons, for example, or paintings. But I mean, that's just a preference. Overall, solid book. I'm glad I read it. Absolutely have someone I want to give this to, because it's just going to be right up their street. For the, okay, now we're getting into some of my, yes. So The Vegetarian, I read, International Booker season inspired. Normal People by Sally Rooney is my Irish author readathon inspired book, and one of the prompts, of course, was to read any green cover, and I've nailed that all over this week. But I wanted to get to this book, which also fulfills the Women's Prize for Fiction long list backlist books, and my second Sally Rooney book after Intermezzo, which I read last year. When I'm well aware that this has become an adaptation, and I've heard the adaptation talked about, and I've heard this book talked about in a way that, again, was deceiving. And, I know I've heard some other people talk about this book in a way that also I would like to talk about this book, but it's funny how, the hype kind of drowns out. And if you read this book and think that it's about two people having sex, then I'm glad for your experience. But I'm willing to bet, and I'm not a betting person, that's not why Sally Rooney wrote this book at all. This book, again, was sort of like in many, she's described as sharp, like just this really sharp writing style, and I couldn't agree more. And I also think, even though there's this sharpness, it's subtle. And there's this thing about people who can really pull off subtlety. And this is going to become more relevant when I talk about these last two books too. That so much is off the page, but it's right there with you when you're on the page. And the fact that Sally Rooney can do that is just amazing to me. The amount of emotion and strife. I think there's a lot of drama in this book. A lot of drama. Like, I wasn't ready for the amount of drama and human strife in this book because of how it was sort of like over marketed as two people who in a toxic relationship having sex and not really talking about things. And that's not the blurb that works for me at all. These are two people trying to come into themselves, into a world that is unkind to everyone around it, and trying to love themselves and each other, and trying to be normal people, whatever, and figure out whatever the F that means, right? And I don't know if I've read a more poignant coming of age, and what I mean by that is coming into adulthood. Not like puberty, but like actualizing into young adulthood and new adulthood, that was more poignant than this book. And I also definitely think that people need to know that there's content warnings for suicide, for domestic violence, and other very serious themes that burrow in with the sharpness of this narrative. And so I actually thought that this was going to be a little bit quicker and wittier and snappier than it was. It ended up being quite devastating for me as a read as well. I will pass this on. I will. Well, now that I'm saying it, maybe I'm not so sure. I definitely think that this book should be reread. And I'm definitely Intermezzo, I just checked out digitally from the library. And I don't know what made me do it. I decided that was going to be my entrance into Sally Rooney. But maybe Sally Rooney will be the one out of, 100 books that I keep for a reread. So now that I'm saying it out loud, maybe this isn't an unhaul. Maybe it'll sit in like on my unhaul tote for a while until I really am real with myself. Do I have plans to read this again? And if I do, then why not hang on to it until I definitively decide not to? I have conversations with friends. It's the only other Sally Rooney I own. It's right here and just off screen. And the book by it I plan to read soon. So I actually even have space on the shelf for this. Another way to make that decision. A Hero's Walk by Anita Rao Badami. Now, first I listened to this and I know that impacted it because there were some like voices that really were grating on my nerves. So had I chose a different modality, I might have had a different experience. But here's what I think about this. And there are books like Yaa Gyasi's Homegoing that are just masterclass and taking a whole bunch of stories and bringing them all together in a way where you know just enough that you feel like you know everybody, and you can handle the immensity. Like the premise of this book is a father disowns his child or is estranged from his child because she breaks off an engagement, and the family lives in India. The child goes to Canada, to Vancouver, BC to study, and she breaks off an engagement to have a love marriage to a Canadian, and I'm gonna say maybe a Euro, but it's implied but not explicitly said, I think, in the book, or at least that I noticed, that this is a white Christian traditioned Canadian man that she marries. And so the father is furious and is estranged. And the daughter tries to keep in touch through all the years. She has a child. And then we start with actually with the kind of point of view of the child. And then very, very tragically, the child's mother, the father's the father's daughter who's disowned the daughter, she and her husband die in a car accident. So we have a whole swath of the book that's dealing with the dynamics, the family dynamics between the wife and the husband. And there's a brother, so a son involved. Their dynamics as they deal with grief, and I appreciated that. And then there's this piece where the father goes to Vancouver to pick up the granddaughter, and she doesn't quite, like, she's too young to really understand what's going on, and then her kind of dealing with, well, the vastly different cultures. And some of that was interesting, but then it just started to do so much. It went into all of these backstories of everybody in the town and backstories of different lives. And I wanted more. I actually just wanted more about the relationship between these grandparents and this granddaughter. And I thought that there was little nuggets in there, but then they got so diluted with all of these other backstories and side stories, and it felt cluttered. And it felt unfinished. And it felt like it was actually distracting me as a reader from the thing that I really wanted, which was to explore just that more. I think I would almost go as far as to say I didn't like this book. There were parts of it that I could really engage in, but I honestly think that I didn't like this book. I was becoming frustrated with the fact that I just couldn't get to the pieces of the story that I was really hoping it was going to explore, that it kind of sold me from its intro, and then scattered throughout, but then kept kept getting sidetracked. I don't know. And almost like some days when had a little bit too much coffee and there's too many things on my mind and then I'm talking about everything all at once. It's kind of, this book kind of reminded me of that. So needless to say, a little bit hectic and unrefined in some ways. And I found that so disappointing that I would almost go to say that I didn't have a very good time with this book. Certainly things to read, certainly stories that, at least the beginning of them, that are worth being told. And this book, I read it because it was longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. So, I mean, there are readers who found things to love in this book. So, hopefully, and this is signed. Yes. Yeah. And this is signed. So hopefully when I put this back out, somebody, will just appreciate it. And like, maybe like all of those sub stories. Maybe that's what they're looking for more than I did. I didn't have a great time with this book. And then, so I kind of went in reverse order of how I read them. The first book that I read way back more than a week ago now was How Beautiful We Were by Mbola Mboye. Mbola Mboye is an author whom I've hauled 2 books from, and she's a Cameroonian American author, and I have been sort of like, it took me a long time to get to this book, and so I feel like I kind of built up anticipation for this book as well. Again, here is a story that I am so glad I had access to hear. The story is told in a made up African country, in a made up African village, and it's been, survived colonization, and then has a, from what I can tell, quite corrupt leader that's not really interested in the well-being of the people of the land, and particularly this village. There are like 7 or 8 villages, I think, that are interconnected, and we learn like the impact of an American oil company on both the environment but also the people living there. So, well, it's fictionalized. It's not like it tracks. It's just no country and or town is named in the book. It did this interesting thing where it goes through different members of the tribe, and in some cases of the family, and then it goes back to like the children. They keep calling it the children, which is this, I think they called it age friend group or similar age group, where we do have a heroine that kind of emerges, an activist, and she's from that group. Some of the points of view I liked better than others. I found it interesting to keep calling that group the children when they were grown. And that, that seems picky, but like, and I know it was like a phase, like it's almost like a chorus. But it threw me off a little, because I was like, then this should just be maybe the continued view of the children, because children do bring in a different perspective than adults. But it continued to be like this group of people from whom the activist heroine belonged. There's also this phase when the heroine goes to America, on a scholarship. And there are some pieces where she becomes quite an activist and involved in ways that it really resonated with me. But when she starts writing letters, and I don't think part of this is just me, it's a me thing. Epistolary doesn't really work with me. It makes me fall out of the story a lot. And I struggle even with the italic text. Like it's really hard for me to read without getting a headache, like no matter what I put the font size up on. So when I run into this italicized text, already I'm feeling kind of annoyed because I have to figure out how I'm going to read this or how I'm going to access this without getting a headache. But then, like, I didn't feel like the tone, the novel, the letters didn't feel authentic to me. They felt really contrived. I don't know how else to say it. Like, the voice didn't feel authentic. And again, when we go through multiple points of view, not to bring up Yagase again, but it takes a lot to go through different points of view and really develop these character voices to really embody the person, this character, and bring them to life, and not just kind of make them like you put a name on the page and therefore I'm supposed to accept that this is a different point of view. And I think Boy does this sometimes, but then kind of falls off, and other points of view. And so I found some of the chapters more engaging than others, and because of that, it almost like, and then it's sort of like reading a short story collection when some of the short stories work better than others. And that's sort of like how you end up feeling about the whole work. So I would say this is better, you know, than the way I felt about the Hero's Walk and Wayward. And I'm certainly glad sometimes, again, it's not even about necessarily the craft of the writing. It's about the story that, you know, I have to be happy to have access to. So for that reason, I'm really glad to have access to this story, and where there have those issues with the storytelling are real. Like I'm going to pretend like I don't have opinions. I'm still really glad that I read this book, and I am, you know, looking forward to reading Behold the Dreamers as well. Maybe have some kind of hope that Behold the Dreamers is a little better than this one, but we shall see. And yeah, that's it. That's a whole heck of a lot. There were some really small novels, and then because of commuting and like just walking a lot, my listening, I put like, it really adds if I can listen a lot more in addition to the, you know, couple hours that I get to read every day. So that adds my stack up. Yeah, I'm already on to my next both listen and read. So we'll be checking in soon with the next week's, maybe the final week of March's TBR. Maybe things are already off hold, so I got to sort that out. But until then, I'm just gonna read. And oh, and then, you know, my college child's coming home in a week, and that could slow me down or not. I don't know. I don't care really. Just reading is about what you get to, isn't it? So until next time,